My husband and I have been married for 28 years and everything was fine with us. Until I met him, a man who was 15 years younger than me and who gave me a new breath of fresh air. I was happy for a moment, but the consequences I had to face were a real horror. I had planned to arrive early at the lawyer's office, but when my lawyer and I were ushered into the conference room, I was surprised to find Patrick and his lawyer already there. The familiar twinge of jealousy hit me as I observed him interacting with the attractive woman. Deep down, I always felt a bit inferior to him. At 48, he was an impressive catch. Handsome, tall, muscular, a successful business owner, and head of the local Chamber of Commerce. The thought that today might seal the end of feeling his comforting arms terrified me. Patrick barely acknowledged me as I followed my lawyer into the room. My face turned pale when the red-haired lawyer reached out to reassure Patrick, interpreting it as a signal to get rid of the situation so she could end their professional relationship and perhaps explore a more personal one. Patrick smiled, but his gaze at me was neutral, leaving me frustrated by his determination not to engage in any conversation. As the meeting began, my lawyer chatted with the red-haired attorney, and I sat down across from Patrick. He took out a folder, opened it, and laid out a 2-page script. Patrick, with his laptop and speakers, seemed prepared but neutral. I had spent days preparing for this meeting and knew my script by heart. Patrick's familiar face showed no emotion, no anger, no hate, no grief. I had expected a private meeting, but Patrick insisted on lawyers being present. For the next hour, I was set to bare my soul and hoped to make Patrick acknowledge his contribution to the breakdown of our 28-year marriage. It frustrated me that we couldn't have a private conversation, but dwelling on negatives wouldn't help. My lawyer set a kitchen timer, and as it ticked loudly, the room fell into silence. I glanced at my notes and crossed my fingers. I decided to begin by admitting my wrongdoing and taking full responsibility, aiming to appeal to Patrick's emotions. I wanted to repair his ego, subtly suggesting he played a part in justifying my inappropriate behavior. I thanked Patrick for agreeing to meet and confessed my self-centeredness. I believed Patrick wanted to forgive me but needed a reason. My entire speech aimed to provide that justification, especially since the kids were not present. As I spoke, I observed Patrick's reaction, but to my surprise, he remained neutral, calmly marking a check next to the first sentence in his notes. My confidence wavered as I realized I might not have surprised him at all, forgetting that our shared history allowed him to anticipate my arguments just as much as I thought I knew him. I must confess that I was taken aback and needed to stick to my prepared explanation. As I told Patrick, all of this was a result of my own foolish and selfish choices. I found myself feeling lost, without children, and grappling with feelings of aging and unattractiveness. Scott entered the scene while we were both involved in a church committee. He was charming and clearly skilled in the art of seduction, knowing precisely how to manipulate emotions. He began by posing as a sympathetic friend, offering a listening ear to my problems after church meetings. This started last year when you were frequently away. One day, he suggested grabbing coffee after the church meeting, and naively, I agreed. At that point, everything seemed innocent, and he appeared to be a good friend. Little did I realize that he was adept at breaking down a woman's defenses. Coffee meetings gradually progressed to more luxurious restaurants where he shared grievances about his marriage. I admit it's a cliché, but by then, I had placed my trust in him. The restaurants became increasingly upscale, and the gifts he bestowed upon me became more enticing. Patrick, you wouldn't believe the boost it gives a woman when a man 15 years her junior tries to win her over. Proudly, I told Patrick that 4 months ago, Scott propositioned me to sleep with him, but I firmly refused. However, I didn't break off contact with him despite knowing his intentions. I had become somewhat dependent on the confidence boost he provided. I paused, sniffled, and wiped my eyes with the onion-stained finger, feeling the sting. One teary eye seemed sufficient. I hesitated, stuttered, and faltered, expressing my shame. I admitted that I should have ended things, especially when his intentions were clear. I acknowledged that my ego and confidence had become dependent on his complex. I then recounted a regretful incident where, under the influence of alcohol, Scott kissed me in the driveway. I was too drunk to resist, and, concerned about the neighbors, I ushered him inside by opening the garage door. The following details, involving a spare bedroom and my actions, are a source of deep shame for me. I will carry the weight of this mistake until my last breath. I allowed him to do whatever he wanted, and I am deeply sorry, Patrick. The only solace I have is that I was coherent enough to persuade him to use a condom after Scott came. I believe we both fell asleep. I, due to intoxication, and he, perhaps due to fatigue after months of chasing. I wouldn't have done this if I weren't inebriated and depressed. When I woke up, the shame hit me hard. Your entrance into the room, turning on the light, and the pain on your face crushed me. I understood the immense harm I caused to you and us with a single mistake. Tears streamed from my eyes as I pleaded with my husband. Despite a lifetime together, I couldn't decipher his expression. He remained neutral, absorbed in his laptop. To my surprise, he played an audio clip on his screen. It was my voice, expressing disdain for his beer breath. The room fell silent, overwhelmed by the embarrassing revelation. The humiliation of being caught with Scott by you seemed trivial compared to the enormous lie I had been living. I clung to a prepared script, desperately attempting to salvage the situation. Patrick's lawyer wore a slight smile, while mine appeared embarrassed. Patrick stared at me, his expression inscrutable. It never occurred to me to question why he had an audio recorder. The silence stretched, and I fumbled through my prepared speech, claiming it was a one-time mistake. But then Patrick clicked again, revealing the truth in my own words. The whole facade crumbled in just 30 words, no longer a one-time drunken error, but a calculated lie. I stood speechless, desperately searching for any sign in Patrick's gaze. The ticking timer emphasized the rapid passage of the 60 minutes I had sought to salvage our marriage, and it was clear the attempt had failed spectacularly. In my panic, I apologized for the initial lie, admitting that it wasn't the first time. I thought convincing you it was a singular incident would spare you further hurt. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I wouldn't be so hurt if I could just remain silent. But now it seems I have to confess I dated Scott multiple times a week for over 6 months, unbeknownst to Patrick. The trouble was, I didn't know the extent of Patrick's knowledge. He had recorded conversations, indicating that the night he caught Scott and me wasn't the only instance. I felt the weight of the situation, realizing that one more lie could end it all. So, Juliana, it's time to be vague, avoid details, and stick to the facts. Scott did seduce me, and it took a while. He has a thing for older women, and I admit I wasn't strong enough to resist. While I considered lying about using the master bed only once, I couldn't ignore the uncertainty about how long Patrick had known. I chose to remain silent on that matter. Despite this, I couldn't stay silent on everything. With little time to change this catastrophic situation, I glanced at my notes and focused on a few words highlighted in capital letters. But I never stopped loving and respecting you, Patrick. I've never given you less love than before. Scott was just an extra dimension to my life, not taking anything away from you, but merely overflowing, if I can describe it that way. As I fell silent, Patrick returned his attention to his laptop screen, appearing confused for a moment. He struggled to find something, and for a split second, his expression shifted from neutral to puzzled. However, he soon relaxed, realizing it was one of the open files. I hoped he didn't fully grasp the situation. He restarted the video, and I cringed again at Scott's question about me in our marital bed. My own words condemned me once more. Patrick seemed to accept my explanation about sneezing, but the sinking feeling intensified. The fact that I offered to clean his leg and knelt down distracted him. The satisfaction I initially felt had vanished, knowing the challenging conversation ahead. Clear signs were apparent now. However, I concede that he is simply an ignorant fool. Sometimes, I entertain the thought of engaging in intimate acts right here while he's present, just to see if he would notice. The mockery in my voice and the words themselves made me realize that I was belaboring the point. I couldn't convince myself that I still loved and respected my husband, let alone convince him. Once again, I found myself spiraling into a vortex of confusion. Before this meeting, I convinced myself that I loved and respected Patrick. But after my actions and words, such sentiments seemed impossible. In the tense silence following the final blow, Patrick turned to look at me. I couldn't meet his gaze, so I turned to his lawyer. The disdain on her face made me shudder, erasing any doubts that Patrick was merely another client to her. Turning away from her, I glanced at my lawyer, who failed to conceal her disdain. Here I am, in a room fighting for my future, surrounded by people who view me as something they stepped into at the dog park, and one of them should be on my side. My confidence evaporated like dew in the midday sun, and my self-esteem wasn't far behind. Perhaps that's why I revisited my notes and decided to take an offensive stance. I pointed out to Patrick that over the last 6 months he had been paying me less attention, taking me for granted, going on business trips more frequently, and seemingly distancing himself at a time when our children left home, and I felt lost. He was never there when I needed him, didn't assure me that I wasn't as old and unattractive as I felt, and failed to offer comfort when I needed it most. I paused, and Patrick's attention shifted back to his screen, fingers dancing again. I cringed as he opened a file just after our ill-fated second round, shortly before Patrick ended our relationship. The revelation stung, and I lowered my eyes to the table, avoiding judgmental glances. Recalling my state during the last conversation, the truth was evident. The novelty of having a lover, even someone as young and energetic as Scott, was wearing thin. Scott's irritation about the situation and my actions were starting to weigh on me, causing a loss of respect for Patrick and pricking my conscience. The loss of respect was more significant than I initially acknowledged. The reason for my emotional detachment from my husband was something I had to confront as I prepared for a meeting, where I initially planned to blame him for pulling away. However, I realized it was a lie to continue betraying him. I emotionally distanced myself from Patrick, making the decision to cut off intimacy, especially since Patrick's lovemaking was vastly different from Scott's. Rejecting my husband's advances became a pattern, and I only later grasped that Patrick had given up on our sex life around the same time he started working longer hours and being away more often. Now facing this revelation, I felt completely confused about who was distancing from whom. If Patrick knew about my affair weeks before confronting me, he was more cunning than I had thought. My planned approach to the meeting seemed futile, and I found myself at a loss about what to do. Though I usually preferred planning, I had to act spontaneously, given the urgency. Desperate, I searched through my notes for some glimmer of hope, but the recordings turned out to be a diversion. I realized the game had changed, and if Patrick knew about my departure for a while, I needed to understand his state of mind. He was offended by my betrayal, but his primary concern was my motivation. Did I find his love-making unsatisfactory? Did I want to explore my kinky side or run away with Scott? These were fears and doubts I needed to address. In a desperate attempt to convince him of my love and respect, I examined my feelings and motivations. I had to prove that I still loved and respected him despite the recorded conversations. I succeeded in persuading him not to insist on an immediate divorce, but the ticking clock reminded me that time was running out. I gathered my courage and faced Patrick across the table. I expressed my genuine love for him, my desire to spend my life with him, and my regret for the shame he felt upon catching me. I admitted that Scott was a distraction, driven by lust and selfishness, and assured Patrick that I never intended to run away with him. I acknowledged the wrongdoing, especially in response to Patrick's offer to make love less, and confessed that the encounters with Scott lacked the emotional depth I had with my husband over the years. The challenge was convincing him of these truths and proving that my love and respect for him were genuine. The dissolution of a marriage felt like time had slowed down for everyone around me, even though my own pace remained normal. My attorney, positioned to my left, expressed her disapproval by throwing her pen on the table, turning to me with a look of absolute disdain. It was evident that in that moment, I couldn't even pay someone to be on my side. To my dismay, I realized that Patrick on the opposite side wasn't playing audio files, as I had assumed, but rather video clips. This revelation heightened the severity of the situation. My lawyer conveyed her displeasure by grabbing my husband's hand, offering a physical sign of support. Although Patrick wasn't looking at me, his reaction showed a split second of devastation. I witnessed a single tear escaping the eye nearest to me. Was he suffering, or had he fortified himself by focusing on the screen? In that moment, my mind recorded a few irrelevant facts. The recording was made 3 weeks before the collision, implying Patrick had observed my betrayal over time, enough to discern a pattern. As the speakers played, the atmosphere shifted from the heat of the moment to a sense of dirtiness and tastelessness. The divorce papers were laid out in front of me by my lawyer, and I found myself powerless to counter the vile behavior Patrick had uncovered. Patrick acted like an orchestra conductor, orchestrating our separation without uttering a single word. His execution was precise, dismantling all my rationalizations, minimizations, and feeble attempts at reconciliation. In this orchestrated demise, Patrick did not speak. He simply directed, revealing the sections of the orchestra he wanted to play next with unparalleled ease. The last video clip played without hesitation, and Patrick, without looking, anticipated my arguments. I had overlooked that, just like I had observed him for 3 decades. He had looked back at me with his astute, penetrating eyes. Overwhelmed by shame and humiliation, I sought an escape. Running back to the house that still felt like home, at least until the eviction notice arrived as part of the agreement, became my refuge. It was an escape to my children, hoping they would remain oblivious to the painful truth and continue to love me unconditionally. The only path to redemption seemed through accepting the loss of a significant part of my life. I grabbed the pen, signed the agreements, and discarded it in one fluid motion. Surprisingly, Patrick's business wasn't valued as much as I thought according to my lawyer's assessment. It became apparent that Patrick had ample time to conceal most of his assets. Frustrated, I muttered, "Son of a..." Thankfully, the last recording had concluded, and an eerie silence took over. My attorney collected the signed documents, handed me a copy, stashed the rest in her briefcase, and left the room. I sat there, feeling frozen, torn between the desire to run and the hope of leaving with a positive message that might hint at a potential rekindling of the flame. Wanting to convey that I still cared about Patrick's well-being, I lingered, but the abrupt sound of an alarm clock spurred me into action. As I stood up, I uttered my optimistic phrase, and I noticed that the jackal now clasped Patrick's hand firmly. I pleaded with him not to ruin his life by seeking revenge on Scott and ending up in prison. The possibility of never forgiving myself for such an outcome loomed large. Patrick responded by sharing another disturbing video, fortunately not featuring my voice but that of another woman with a sharp, almost shrill tone. The mention of Scott's fate, divorced and penniless, seemed fitting for the scammer. The burden on my conscience intensified, realizing the gravity of what he had endured because of my actions. I couldn't bear to look Patrick in the face, unsure if he was expressionless, laughing or crying. It all hurt. As I prepared to leave, bidding him a tearful goodbye, I acknowledged that I deserved everything he threw at me. My feeble attempt to cling to my old life was discarded like a plague beetle. Perhaps my daughter Megan would visit while I drowned my sorrows in oblivion, and if not her, then maybe my son Joel. As I started to push the door, voices behind me caught my attention. Another record played featuring an excited young male voice calling me a cheater. A familiar female voice, undoubtedly my daughter, intervened, questioning the accusation. I left the room, wondering if Megan or Joel would be there for me. The future looked bleak as I contemplated drinking alone.
How do you like the story? Write your opinion in the comments. Tell us what you would do if, God forbid, you found yourself in a similar situation. I think that the man did the right thing, even if it was under strong emotional influence. What do you think?